presentation. And now we're recording. Perfect timing. Yeah, so yep, this is a basic presentation of my master's thesis, which I completed in 2024. I've since continued the research in my PhD studies, but we're just going to focus on what was covered in the master's thesis with a couple of important additions from me as I've been studying now. Right. As you could probably imagine, water is a bit difficult to analyze in archaeological contexts. There's a phrase introduced by Dr. Richard Oram, who studies Scottish environmental history and medieval history, and he calls it fast and slow violence. So the environment is changing both very quickly and very suddenly, but also very slowly over time, depending on how you look at it. And for this research, there's been research in Icelandic monasteries about artifacts related to water use at monasteries. Lífsins vatn by Hermann Kjartansson is a big one. And it was looking at individual artifacts as well as sort of aerial photography of the landscape around the monastery and measuring distances. And for this, I wanted to introduce the concept of entanglement, which was made popular in archaeology by Ian Hodder, because I think that it hits upon a really important aspect of studying landscape in archaeology, in that archaeology is focused so much on the human products, on the material culture sometimes, and the archaeology site itself, but thinking in terms of integrating the wider landscape as affecting people's perspectives on the places that they're settling, how they might want to settle, how they might want to use the resources allotted to them by the environment. And so I wanted to introduce that and do a mixed discipline study. I came into it with 3 research questions, mostly to what extent is the environment affecting water supply and storage, and how does that relate to attitudes of medieval monastic people to the environment at the time? What can the material evidence, or perhaps the absence of certain material artifacts, tell us about water technology in medieval Icelandic monasteries? And then what methods are most useful to us as archaeologists in studying this? Is it traditional artifact analysis, as the status quo says, or are we looking at integrating more landscape or geography or ecology into the practice? And this was sort of a 3-tiered method study. I started by looking at Icelandic literature about the land access and use in these 2 locations, Þingeyraklaustur and Kirkjubæjarklaustur, as well as some saga material, not so much for a historical fact review, but for looking at attitudes towards these and knowledge of these landscapes at the time. And after that, it was spatial and site analysis using aerial photography provided by Loftmundur, and using the program ArcGIS to look at that and look for sites and features. There was also metadata that was free to access on rivers and standing water today in Iceland through náttúrufræðistofnun that I was able to integrate into that. And of course, there is looking at the artifacts. There were continuous excavations at Þingeyrar and Kirkjubæjarklaustur with the Between Man and Nature project from 2022 to 2024. And this will provide a lot of what was found in those excavations. And the model that you're looking at is from the one of the best sources on monastic landscape use and water, Dr. James Bond. That is his real name. Did a sort of comprehensive study of water systems of English abbeys and monasteries, and while he found that they were extremely varied, he had this model for sort of categorizing the aspects that he found. They weren't always, it wasn't that every single monastery had all of these features, but he created this comprehensive model for how the features fit into providing for the monastery, which I hope to use later and put things that I found in this study into this model. So yeah, unsurprisingly, when we're talking about water in a cultural context, it's very important for the settlement of any area. There needs to be sustainable access to water, and that means that water is culturally a really huge, important factor. Access to water isn't just survival, it's power, it's sustainability, it's continuity of culture to be in a place where water is abundant. And this became sort of part of the focus of archaeologists. In the 70s, there was a movement of American and English archaeologists looking at landscape, both as the important factor in why areas are settled and why they are continuously occupied over multiple time periods and cultures. And that, I have to read my notes again. That introduced this concept that was really helpful to me, landscape phenomenology, which to some is how landscape is used and interpreted, is informed by perspective. So how we are arriving to the landscape and how we are looking at it is not the way it would have looked to the medieval person or the Neolithic person or the Norse settlement person, because it's changed over time. And because we have different technologies, they're looking at it from the ground, we're looking at it maybe from the air or through our technological lenses. And there were a couple of important environmental shifts at the time that the monasteries would have been active. They would have been active 1133 to 1542 roughly. And in that time, we know that there was a period of increased temperature and wetter conditions called the medieval warming period at the earliest, lasting until 1350-ish. And then after that was the Little Ice Age, temperatures dropped, and we were looking at more wintry conditions. So that's important to think about when we think about historical environment. They're not going to have the same climate as we do today. So when we analyze things like landscape, we have to keep in mind that and not just copy paste what we see today into that image. And archaeologists have been continuing research in this field through thinking in terms of landscape phenomenology and entanglement, and also using technology like ArcGIS to sort of help build these maps. When it comes to studying water on monasteries, there has been a big increase in this sort of focus. And one of the archetypes of looking at how water could be used as a monastery is the St. Gall's Cathedral plan, where there's a garden in the middle of the cloister, and there's an irrigation system, and it connects to latrines. And this is thought of as a great example of a monastic water system. And there have been studies on water technology in the medieval period in general. One of the people I cite is Roberta Magnusson. And what she found is that St. Gall is a great idea, but it's not nearly replicated everywhere all the time. And that a lot of how monasteries source water into them is political. It's based on their relationship to their community and legal access to water lines or water sources that were already being used by farmers and other urban communities. So there's a sort of this concept of hybridity of mixing the spiritual and the sacred, of having the practical concerns of legal entities and the actual reality. And St. Gall's also incorporates some of that sacred aspect of water, of wanting to have a garden, creating paradise within the monastery walls, and making everything self-sustainable. So that I sort of looked at more in meanings of water in early medieval England, how they were cultivating water soundscapes and water environments using gardens, and and things like that. And something else that needs to be considered is the actual text, the actual rules in which the monastic communities were living under. In this case, both of the monasteries here are under Saint Benedict's rule. So when we read the rule of Saint Benedict, there is an increased focus on self-sufficiency, on producing one's own food, and having not an isolate, but a self-sustainable community wherein everything that the monks and nuns need is inside of the monastery. And they lived by this code of ora et labora, prayer and work. So it's assumed that the Benedictine monks and nuns would have been working on making, growing, producing their own food, building these structures, and so on. Now, my thesis gave as many examples as have been studied on both practical and spiritual water use. So I'll just hit upon two that I think are really important. This is a model of one excavation site at Ramsey Abbey in Cambridgeshire. Did I pronounce that correctly? We'll find out later. And this is an abbey that is in originally a walled medieval town in fenlands. So it's like a wetland, like a marsh. And some studies have found that originally, before the monastery was there, when the town was there, it was most often accessed through a causeway. And when the monastery and the town came in, they built bridges in order to get people in there. But there's, one point of entry, and it's essentially an island surrounded by water, but in the sense that the wetlands surround this area, and then the structures are built on a hill. And something interesting that they found in excavating was that there were two phases of ditches around structures. So the top model is, you can see they've cut some ditches and some boundary lines next to this structure. And that would have been from the 1100s to the 1300s. And later, after the 13th century, they've cut this even greater ditch into it that seems to have been filled with water. And they know this by looking at the soil. It was like a wet, waterlogged clay, and they sent some for pollen analysis and found seeds and pollen from waterlogged plants. So they think that they were manipulating the already wetland conditions here in order to create this sort of jetty for this boat for transport. And it also would have served a purpose of being a boundary line, of protecting the structures that were there. And it's not going to be evident in any large scale structure like a water mill or an aqueduct. It's going to be stratigraphic analysis like this, and pollen analysis, ecological information that shows that they were manipulating what was already there in a way that was not going to maybe show up in a archaeological catalog. And another example of more of that sort of sacred water use at monasteries I thought was very interesting, is one that I read about was St. Sunniva in Selja, Norway. It's an island monastery. The monastery is built on a continuous sacred site because, as you can see in the photo on your left, there's a cave nearby the monastery, and there's water running through the cave, and people were known in the Iron Age to go here and drink the water for healing purposes. And in 1170, they moved the relics of Saint Sunniva, who is a hero in Norwegian Christian mythology, to this location, and the monastic community grows around it, and there are continuously pilgrims to this cave. And you can see that the picture on the right is the view from approximately the cave. So you could go in there and then see this monastery and then see the sea all around you. And it cultivates this sort of aesthetic of isolation, of protection, of more sacred ground through water. And I thought these two examples were maybe the best to include in this because one of our locations at Kirkjubæjarklaustur is lower and closer to a water table, and then Þingeyraklaustur is in a peninsula, sort of on top of the hill where the water runs down, and they're just, I think in this case, good examples for what's to come. So let's get into the actual locations. Kirkjubæjarklaustur is the first female monastic house founded in Iceland. It's a Benedictine establishment originally dedicated to the Virgin Mary, and it's founded in, I think, 1186, with the first abbess being Halldóra Egilsdóttir. And what Kirkjubæjarklaustur is known for in its until its dissolution in 1542 is textile production. The nuns were known to make these fine vestments for priests and other religious employees, so to say. There's letters in Diplomatarium Icelandicum commenting on their work being very high quality. And in terms of excavation, there was a very large-scale excavation by Fornleifafræði Stofnun Íslands from 2002 to 2006 on the northwest side of the now standing cemetery wall. So if you're looking at this picture here, this site A relates to what they found here. They found a large structure with multiple rooms, including a possible weaving room, where they found remains of a warp-weighted loom and a spindle whorl and early knitting needles or sewing needles. And these remains were about, at the deepest, 3 meters underground. So there's a lot of material there. And then the Between Men and Nature excavation continued in 2022. This is a geophysical survey taken before then, showing the cemetery walls here, and then some possible structures here. And that's where we picked up in 2022. The Þingeyraklaustur, surveys and excavations. Well, I'll start with the history, actually. It's the longest running male monastery in Iceland, and it's founded in, I think, 1133. And what it's known for is manuscript writing and production. It had a very large library, and there have been artifacts found related to that. Birch bark, we found some seal bones where they might have been taking seal hide, styluses made out of bone. And there's a great inventory list for this that shows that they had a chapter house and a cloister. Even though those structures aren't standing, we can assume that it was a rather large monastery for the time. And after it closed officially in 1551, it became sort of the charge of Danish royalty for upkeep. And previous investigations looking at 19th century to about 17th century material found some of the guardians of the church that used to be there in this area. And then those were excavated and studied. And now, as this geophysical map shows and this picture, the Between Man and Nature excavation moved to approximately here, where you can see the L-shaped wall. That was one of the primary areas of excavation that we began in. We're going to go very quickly through the literature. I'm not going to read several books to you, as I did for this. I categorized in the same vein as the bond model, using reliability, volume, purity, and energy to sort the literature that I was reading, and about both the monasteries and just water in Iceland in general, to see then where we were seeing the literary references to water at these locations. In general, when I was reading the legal framework for water at sites in medieval Iceland, I was gleaming from Jónsbók, which would have been the contemporary legal text at the time. And I found two interesting quotes from both that and Jarnsida about how water was treated at this time, that there should be, you can read it for yourself, I'm not going to read all of this, but water was supposed to be equally sourced to all farms, and that there was actual penalty for damaging that or taking more from the land than was allotted to anyone. And that these, the second one from Jarnsida is very interesting. All water shall run as it did in ancient times. There is not an explanation of what ancient times means in that case, but there seems to be this way they're borrowing on local traditional knowledge of using and controlling water so that it equally falls to all structures at this time. And that I find very interesting, because it goes back to entanglement, that the way that the landscape is set up is how they are using it to provide for themselves. There's not going to be a large aqueduct or underground pipe system. There's going to be using the original settlement methods and the original way that these streams connected or were used in this time. When it comes to finding evidence of Kirkjubæjarklaustur and its water landscape in the literature, we're looking at Diplomatarium Icelandicum primarily. It seems like they used the Rauðá, which will come up in the maps later, as sort of the boundary, and that was where the extent of the property of Kirkjubæjarklaustur ran to. And so that's one positive mention of one of the features we'll be looking at later. And I've included a later literary reference, because in 1783 there is a volcanic eruption of extreme size, which is affects the area very greatly. Eldritith is by a priest that was basically, he was writing as if he was spending his last days there, but he managed to survive because there was this event where these Holtzau and Fjóðá were dammed, and then they ran over the town and stopped the lava from consuming the town. And this line is very interesting. The water was so great that the river was completely unpassable to horses all day before the monastery. So there's an increase of water coming closer to the monastery after this eruption, and it demonstrates that if we're recreating a landscape around Kirkjubæjar in particular, we're going to have some problems, because there was this great big violent change that has made things look a lot different than they used to. More on that later when I show you some aerial photography. Þingeyrar also has a mention in Diplomatarium Icelandicum when it comes to the selling of the land around where the monastery was to Brandur Jónsson and Geirmundur Lýtingsson. There was a list of everything that was split between them, and for the most part things were split equally between them, including a series of dammed streams which would have been used to water the pasture and provide water for their farms, or what would then be sold and become Þingeyraklaustur. I did look into Vatnsdælarsaga as well, again, not as an actual factual report, but to see what water features were mentioned around this site. So we know positively that Hunavat was there in the medieval period, and so was the River Giljá, and that is contemporary to what they would have seen at the time. This is where it's going to become very tough for me, because now as a PhD student, I've actually taken a GIS course, and I can tell you that my maps don't look great because I know what they're supposed to look like. But we're just doing the best we can with what we had at the time. So what we're looking at when it comes to the water landscape here is, obviously there's a lot going on. There's the Skaftá and the Rauðalækur. As you can see, it's outlined because it's been mentioned in the literature. Systrarvatn and Systrarfoss, and we cut it down for brevity's sake because there is a lot of water going on in this place. And then, as we saw from the literature review earlier, the only thing that actually comes up in medieval literature is the Røyðá, and I've been looking for a source for a very long time on the building of Systravat after the medieval period. It's a reservoir. I think it's a man-made structure, and it likely wasn't there in the medieval period. And the naming of it, Sigrun Hannesdottir has a great paper on iconography and identity through place naming in Kirkjubæjarklaustur. And the naming of Systravat is based on post-Reformation sort of folk mythology. It's not actually called that because there were actual nuns bathing in there, as the folk myth goes. So we kind of have to strike it from the record until we can prove without a doubt it was there. So we're looking at Røyðá and we're looking at Skaftá, and some research that was done before my time by Hermann is the possibility of a dried stream bed about here towards Systravat and coming sort of at the foot of the monastery. If that's true, then that would be a pretty handy water source for them. And it might also explain why the site was so wet. So this was the site B, or the middle of the Kirkjubæjarklaustur excavation area. And some of the more severe picture to your left is rain accumulation. But on the right, what you can see is that there is a water table that we've hit in the very middle, and every day without fail we would have to pump this. So and based on cores taken by Scott, we might be looking at cultural material a meter below that. So clearly this is a very water rich area, and this would have needed draining at the time, or the significant ecological changes through that eruption or through over time are making it so that there's more water here than before. These are some things we have to consider when thinking about the landscape around Kirkjubæjarklaustur. Þingeyraklaustur, we did a similar looking at aerial photography and mapping out what was there based on what we remember from the literature. So Hunavat was there, Gilead was there. Flóðið, the lake, is a known lake that appeared in the 1700s. So that was kind of struck from the record. And so there is, a clear proliferation of fresh and salt water. Hop is a saltwater lake, and then there's the coast. So that's sort of the practical, what we know might have been there. There is also the legend of the Gvendarbrunnar, the holy well blessed by Guðmundur Arason, and the location of that isn't included in here yet, because when I was reading the literature, I read Guðmundur Saga. It doesn't give an exact location, and we have to sort of re-examine that. I would love to go and actually get a read on it. And its location is not quite exactly known. And now we get to the stuff that I'm used to, the stuff that was not completely new to me, the archaeological analysis. Something that was found in the fornleifafræði excavation of the first site was a possible culvert between areas of the building, like rooms of the building and barrels, and this could have been a way that they were funneling or draining water out. And we're not quite finding that in the sites A through D of Kirkjubæjarklaustur on the other side of the fence. Mostly there wasn't that much structural that was found. We found the corner of a turf structure and then mostly midden material. So there were a lot of interesting artifacts that came out of that, more textile related artifacts like spindle whorls and textile fragments, and a lot of metal and a bit like the Ramsey excavation, a lot of very wet, clayey soil. So that, in combination with the water table and what we found about water sources at the time, I'm willing to bet that it was just generally very wet in this area anyway, and that the midden was sort of strategically placed here. And that's why we're not finding that many structures. But of course, we can't conclusively say that because we're not sure that we made it to the proper monastic period. In site A, for example, we only made it to 16th century material. And when it comes to Þingeyraklaustur, this was written before the 2024 excavation cycle, so I'll have to add some things at the end. There was a lot found last year that wasn't found at the time of my writing. For me, 2023 was a very exciting year, or 2022 more accurately, because one of the things we found was this L-shaped turf wall with an opening in it. And there's a bit taken out from the test trench that was done in the 2010s. And if you can see sort of like the red blob outlines from my days before proper GIS training, there's this sort of curved ditch that could have been a drain. It goes through the opening of the wall and then around it and stops there. Originally, when we found it, it was just full of peat ash, and it just looked like there was tons of peat ash from burning peat for fuel or for smithing. And when we cleared it out, it was this very it was a proper, like, 20 centimeters deep, maybe. And so from what we can understand about turf construction, there might have been ditches like this dug around it to let out water. Could we be looking at a culvert sort of similar to the ones found in Kirkjubæjarklaustur around 2002, 2006? We're not sure. There wasn't other archaeological material in there like wooden slats or stones, but we know from looking at some local traditional knowledge of water manipulation at this time that it would have been more like ditches that were seasonally managed. So this could be that. It could also be a well-worn footpath. Always think about all of the possibilities and not just the ones that you want to see in this case. And in terms of artifacts, there wasn't really anything super specific about water use, spiritual or otherwise, other than this ditch. There was a lot of, again, metal artifacts from 19th century to possibly 12th. And there was a lot more found in 2024. Of course, we found this is one of the coolest pieces, was this effigy of the Virgin Mary holding the infant Jesus. This was found in a burial. And we found even more turf structures that were even older. If you look back here, the turf wall has Hekla 1104 sort of in the construction of it. And then we were finding, at the same time as this material, even older turf structures without that. So Þingeyraklaustur seems to be a very prolific, continuous occupied site. And hopefully there will be more excavation in the future because it's very exciting. And so to just summarize, before I run completely out of time, I reintroduced Bond's model of looking at water resources in this, in looking for what is providing pure water, reliable sources of water, energy use, and volume. And I've sort of put the different aspects that I found in studying this in there, including the natural landscape. In general, what I found was that there wasn't at either site a lot of archaeological material related to this. There's been pieces found and interred at Thjóðminjasafn before like baptismal fonts and hand washing stations. And in general, the archaeological material was more useful in telling us a bit more of the habits of people at the monasteries, or possibly after, in some cases, like in Kirkjubæjarklaustur. It was really useful to be able to read the literature and see what was talked about by medieval people at the time, and sort of cross-reference that with what we can see today. And the use of entanglement in this was really helpful in thinking more critically about just what the environment would have looked like in the past, and thinking about in landscape analysis, there's this concept of affordances. What is possible for the environment to give to the cultures there? And so that was mostly what I found to be useful, was being able to cross-reference and try to make up these mental maps of what could have been there and what might probably wasn't there. And there's a lot that I would want to add to this, that I intend to add to this in the PhD. For one, my ability to use spatial analysis tools like GIS was very limited at this time, and so I should be able to do better with that in creating better medieval landscape maps at the time. And just increasing knowledge about that. My PhD is also looking to compare an example, in this case Þingeyrar, to a Scottish example, and my questions there are going to be how much of water use and organization is based on environment and how much of it is culturally based. So now that I have sort of a framework for how to look at these things and also how not to, I would like to continue doing that. At the end, I also added to this model one final idea, which was like boundary or security, that was missing from the model, because we can see in the literature like Diplomatarium Icelandicum that there's sort of like water used as a boundary, water used as a gate, which you can see that like Oroidau sort of fits in between that. And for now, that is all that I have for you. So thank you for being here. Thank you in particular to people who were in the Between Men and Nature excavation team. A lot of your work was very integral to this. And I'm open for questions if there are any.